Hello everyone and welcome back to Histories Tech. And today we are going to be looking at the origins of the main battle tank. Now I have made previous videos where I discussed the origins of the tank from World War I and the most popular tanks of World War II. But this video will focus on the history and how we arrived at the main battle tank that we use today. If you'd like to know more about World War I and World War II tanks, please go see some of my earlier videos. But let's go ahead and look at the evolution of tanks that led us to the main battle tank. So if you know anything about World War I tanks, you know they came in a variety of sizes, and throughout the war they went from being small like the French Renault to incredibly massive like the British Mark I, through their later Mark series like the Mark V, and then there were even larger tanks, some that even were more massive in just total weight than modern day tanks. But as they packed on more and more firepower and armor to try to protect these tanks, they made them slower. Making them slower made them a better target. So it was actually the British that came up with a way of getting around this. During the interwar period in the 1920s and the 1930s, the British actually started experimenting with what we would now call a medium tank. And these tanks combined both the lighter tank's speed and capabilities and maneuverability with heavier tanks' armor and firepower. And these medium tanks became so popular in design that they became the basis of World War II tanks. Look at the Panzer series, the T series like the T-34 from the Soviets, or like the M4 Sherman. All of these are medium tanks. And while they did fill in this medium issue between having heavy armor and speed, there were still other tanks being designed at the time. You had tank destroyers, you had light tanks, you had heavy tanks, you had super heavy tanks appearing at this time. So towards the end of World War II, we start to see this transition, taking these medium tanks and providing them with better arms to improve with their capabilities so that you wouldn't need so many different classes of tanks. You could get away with just having one basic type of tank. And we see this with tanks such as like the German Panther, the Russian T-44, or the American M26 Pershing, which were all designed to fill this gap, be a medium tank with better firepower. But the great debate of tank power still loomed right after the end of World War II, and that was, do you build a light tank that can support the infantry, or do you build a heavy tank that can basically take on other enemy tanks? And there really was no in-between at this point in time. You look right at the end of World War II, you still see many nations still building ridiculously large and heavy tanks that, while slow, could take on enemy fixed positions. They could take on other tanks without any issues. And really towards the end of World War II, you start to see this concentration of ideas of taking heavier guns and placing them onto lighter tanks. Great example of this would be adding weapons such as like a 105mm or a 90mm gun motor or a 3-inch cannon onto the M4 Sherman. It is in the post-war era that we really began to see this massive change in tanks. Of course, it would be the British, the innovators of tank warfare, that would create this new design known as a universal tank. The universal tank concept was thought of as early as 1943, and it basically came from the development of the Cromwell tank. While trying to improve the speed of the Cromwell tank, they realized that there was a need for a very fast tank that could also carry the heavier arms as seen in cruiser tanks. When the British began developing what would be known as the Centurion tank in 1945, they wanted to incorporate both these ideas. They wanted a fast, maneuverable tank that could take on any tank at the time and maybe even later tanks by having heavier firepower. And thus the Centurion was born. The Centurion tank's universal tank design was so successful that it actually served from 1946 into the 1980s and became the basis for many other nations' concepts of a universal tank, later known as a main battle tank. And not to be left out, the United States and the Soviets both began developing their own transitional tanks. Now, some consider the M48 an actual main battle tank, and depending on what source you look at, it's either considered a main battle tank or it's just a medium tank. However, this is the tank that pushes the United States into main battle tanks. The same thing can be said about the Soviet T-54 and 55, which was an upgrade of the T-44, which was that better medium tanks that the Soviets had at the end of World War II. And again, this is one of those tanks that is considered by some a main battle tank, others they consider it a medium tank, and there's kind of a back and forth on it, but it is the tank that pushed the Soviets towards the main battle tank. The tanks that are not up for debate being main battle tanks are the American M60 Patton, and this is the tank that basically the United States went full behind the main battle tank doctrine with. This is the tank that met all the requirements for the United States during the 1960s to have that universal role. It had the firepower necessary to protect itself. It had sufficient armor to protect itself. And it could post itself as the main assault role needed at the time. And because of all these qualities and the ability to upgrade it so easily, this tank is still in service to this day. Now, another tank that filled a similar role was that of the Soviet T-64 main battle tank. And it met very much the exact same roles as the M60. It had the sufficient armor and firepower to form a frontline role that was necessary to be designated as a main battle tank. And this is why by the time we get to the 1970s, 13 nations are manufacturing main battle tanks. And these include countries like China, France, West Germany, Britain, India, Italy, Japan, the Soviet Union, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States. And while there are surplus leftovers from, World War II and the Korean War still being used, everyone is transitioning at this time period to the main battle tank. And while the Vietnam War did kind of disseminate the idea of the main battle tank in favor of attack helicopters, by the time we hit the first Gulf War, the main battle tank's role had been solidified. The main battle tank actually outperformed the attack helicopters during the Persian Gulf War, and because of that, more nations began to transition over to the main battle tank, which is why we see a continuous development of main battle tanks to this day. But there you have it, just a quick look at the origins of the main battle tank. This wasn't some quantum leap of technology. This was an evolution of technology. And out of necessity, this idea for a universal tank, which would become known as the main battle tank, would be born. And it is because of this necessity that the main battle tank continues to be developed and improved. And it is the longest classification of tank in existence. And I do want to let you know that while I didn't go into heavy about some of these tanks, I will be talking about several of these in the future. I am going to go through the M48 and the M60, the M1 Abrams. I'll be talking about the T-55s. So that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.